Watcher in the Walls. The year was 1803. The small village of Grimwood lay hidden in the shadow of dense, mist-laden forests, a place untouched by progress and steeped in superstition. At its heart stood a decrepit mansion known as Blackthorn Manor, abandoned for nearly a century. Its windows, gaping like hollow eyes, stared out over the moors, and its towering stone walls seemed to exhale an ancient chill. Strange occurrences took place within the manor walls, faint whispers seeping through the cracks, flickering lights in abandoned rooms, and an overwhelming feeling of being watched even at midnight. No one dared approach the manor, much less cross its creaking threshold. Except for one man. Edward Kane was an antiquarian who sought knowledge more from curiosity than prudence. His interest in Blackthorn Manor arose from a small, obscure journal found in the archives of Cambridge University. The journal was that of Victor Blackthorn, who had been the last recorded person living at the manor. The date of the journal was 1681 and contained cryptic notes regarding experiments, rituals, and a haunting repetition of words across its pages. The walls see all. Edward's journey to Grimwood was both academic and personal. Having spent his life chasing mysteries that others believed couldn't be solved, this manor felt different in itself, the secrecy hovering above it, unwilling locals even to speak about the matter, and strange information scattered throughout Victor Blackthorn's journal told the tale of a story so hidden in time. It was a long ride to Blackthorn Manor. Edward arrived on a foggy afternoon when the landscape was all eeriness and stillness. His carriage driver, an old man named Hargrove, stopped at the edge of the manor grounds. "This is as far as I go," Hargrove muttered, his voice shaking. "Mark my words, Mr. Kane. This place is cursed. If you value your soul, you'll turn back now." Edward dismissed the warning with a polite nod, his leather satchel clutched tightly in his hand. "Thank you, Hargrove. I'll manage from here." The driver hesitated, then flicked the reins. The carriage disappeared into the mist, leaving Edward alone. Before him stood the manor, weathered facade telling time and neglect. Heavy was the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, so the air clung. He could smell them all with each advance towards the entrance. The heavy gate made a screeching welcome or a threatening creak. Inside, the manor was a mausoleum of shadows. Dust motes danced in the dim light that filtered through grime-covered windows. The grand hall stretched before him, its floorboards creaking underfoot. Portraits of the Blackthorn lineage lined the walls, their painted eyes following him with unnerving precision. He spent his time pitching his camp in the library, a room that looked the most intact. Here he was going to find the first clue. A piece of parchment stuffed between pages of an old book. Ink had faded, but the words caused his spine to creep. November 13th, 1681. The ritual is complete. The Watcher is bound to the walls. May its gaze never fall upon the innocent again. What was this ritual? And who, or what, was the Watcher? As night fell, the oppressive silence of the manor seemed to boom louder. Edward lit a lantern and began searching. The more he prowled, the more eccentricities he came across. The walls seemed to whisper faintly as if inhabited. In one room he found a mirror so marred it could hardly tell his face, but he still could have sworn he saw something moving about in its depths. It was after midnight that Edward's apprehension gave way to fear. He decided to withdraw to the library, but rounding a corner, he froze. A faint whisper came through the corridor, low and unintelligible. "Who's there?" Edward called out into the stillness. There was no answer. He traced the sound of movement into a little study at the end of the hall. The door groaned open, exposing the moonlit room. A book lay open on the desk. Pages flapped open despite no breath stirring in the air. Edward's heart hammered as he stepped forward. The words on the page began to change, forming themselves into a message for him. "Leave now while you can. The Watcher sees you." Edward's reasoning told him that what he had seen couldn't make sense, but his instincts told him to get out. He didn't have a chance to act before the door slammed shut behind him and plunged the room into darkness. A cold, suffocating presence wrapped around him. The walls seemed to close in, and the faint hum grew into a sinister whisper. It wasn't one voice, but a cacophony of murmurs, each layered over the other. You shouldn't have come. The walls are watching. It's too late. Edward stumbled backward, clutching the lantern as his only source of solace. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, until they coalesced into a single, bone-chilling sentence. Your fate is sealed. The oppressive presence vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving Edward gasping for breath. He stumbled back to the library and bolted the door, his mind racing. What had he awakened? Was the Watcher a spirit, a curse, or something far worse? Sleep was impossible. The whispers haunted him through the night, seeping through walls like a malignant force. He made up his mind to do whatever it would take to uncover what was going on when dawn finally arrived. He did not yet know it would cost him his very soul. The sunlight filtering through the cracked windows of Blackthorn Manor brought no solace to Edward Kane. His sleepless night left him pale and weary, though he was not shaken. He sat at the library's large oak table, poring over the fragments of information he had collected. The cryptic warnings, the whispers in the night, and the oppressive presence. All pointed to the same thing. Something within the walls was alive. Edward knew he needed answers. The parchment he had discovered in the library spoke of a ritual, dated the 13th of November, 1681, the same year referenced in Victor Blackthorn's journal. What had happened on that fateful night? And why had the walls been bound? To understand the present, Edward realized he had to uncover the past. The morning passed, and Edward continued to search the manor. Architecture seemed labyrinthine in design, with corridors that led seemingly without end, and doors that seemed to open on nothing. The further into the manor he penetrated, the more oppressive the atmosphere grew. In one corridor, he saw a strange detail. Every portrait on the wall had been vandalized. The faces were scratched out in deep, violent gashes. One portrait stood out from the rest. It was in good condition, unlike all the others. Its surface remained untouched by time or vandalism. It was a picture of a strict-looking man with piercing eyes and the aura of authority. Underneath it was a brass plaque, Victor Blackthorn, 1621 to 1683. Edward studied the painting closely. There was something in Victor's eyes. They looked almost alive, as if they were watching him. He leaned forward, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a slight flicker of movement within the painted pupils. He pulled back, his heart thudding. Edward's next discovery was in the form of a hidden passage. Behind the crumbling tapestry in the dining hall, he discovered a narrow staircase spiraling down into darkness. As he went down, he felt the air grow colder, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of blood. Under the staircase, there was a small stone room. He could see nothing in that room except for a plain wooden table, and on it, the ancient book blackened with soot. He felt an overwhelming impression that there were eyes watching him unseen. On the pages of the ancient book were arcane symbols mixed with Latin incantations. Edward turned the leaves one by one. Amidst all the strange-looking characters, one phrase jutted out: "To bind the Watcher, one must offer the blood of the guilty and the soul of the damned. Only then shall its gaze be contained." The implications were horrifying. The Blackthorn family had performed a ritual to trap something within the walls, something malevolent and unnatural. But the most chilling part was a note scrawled in the margin, written in a trembling hand. "The binding weakens. The Watcher stirs." Edward walked back into the library, his thoughts running 1,000 miles an hour. He arranged the book, Victor's journal, and the parchment side by side, as if attempting to assemble pieces of a story. And in doing so, shadows lengthened, and that constant humming grew louder once again. It became so cold all of a sudden that the air could have cut, and those whispers came once more, but louder this time. You should have left. It watches. It waits. Edward stood, his lantern shaking in his hand. The whispers seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if the very fabric of the manor was alive. Then, without warning, the library door slammed shut, and the room plunged into darkness. A deep, guttural voice echoed through the room, chilling Edward to his core. "Why have you come here?" Edward spun around, his lantern casting frantic beams of light. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "I seek the truth," Edward replied, his voice shaking. The walls groaned, and the air grew heavy. "Truth? The truth is death. Leave, while you still can." The voice dissolved into laughter, cruel and mocking, as the walls began to shift. Cracks formed, and from within them, tendrils of shadow slithered out, reaching for Edward. He stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding their grasp, and fled the room. Edward's terror propelled him through the manor's corridors. He could hear the whispers following him, growing louder and more aggressive. He reached the grand hall, only to find the front door sealed shut, as though the manor itself refused to let him leave. Desperate, he turned and ran up the staircase, his pounding on the warped wood of its step. He found himself on a long hallway lined with doors, one every few feet, and each door's edges were slightly ajar. Thinly, from behind each, came faint sobs and whispers, sounds made by unseen occupants trapped inside their own nightmares. A doorway off one hall was shut, covered by scratches across a floor that seemed to signify incomprehensible symbols. This door drew Edward towards its surface, as though someone on the other side urgently needed him. Not rationalizing, he stepped aside the door. The room was small and bare, except for a single object, a mirror mounted on the far wall. Unlike the tarnished mirrors Edward had seen earlier, this one was pristine, its surface gleaming unnaturally. As he approached, he felt a strange compulsion to look into it. When he did, the reflection that greeted him was not his own. Instead, he saw Victor Blackthorn, standing in the same room, staring back at him. "Who are you?" Edward whispered. Victor's lips moved, and yet nothing came out of them. Then the picture distorted. Victor's face twisting into some grotesque image, eyes turning black, mouth opening like an empty hole. The whispers receded once more, but now more desperate, louder, for on the mirror's face a water-like ripple ran. Like in its bottom, the surface began again. Edward tore his eyes away, his heart thudding. The room was growing dark, and he could feel the presence closing in on him. He turned to flee, but the door slammed shut, and he was trapped. The next few minutes were a blur of terror. The mirror started to glow, its surface curving inwards as shadowy figures emerged from it. They had no features, their forms twisting and writhing like smoke. Edward backed against the wall, clutching his lantern as his only weapon. One of the figures lunged at him, its long arms stretching for his throat. Edward swung the lantern wildly. The flame flared when it hit the creature. It recoiled with a shriek, dissolving into black mist. Edward took his chance and sprinted toward the door. To his amazement, it gave way, and he staggered into the hallway, banging the door shut behind him. Panting and trembling, Edward returned to the library. He now knew that Blackthorn Manor was no ordinary haunted house. It was a prison, and he was its latest captive. He would not give in to despair. If Victor Blackthorn's notes were to be believed, there was a way out of this nightmare. Edward vowed to uncover the ritual to which the ancient book told. He was going to find out, cost what the cost may be, and battle the Watcher in its lair. But a small part of his mind couldn't let him go quiet. He was already past due. Edward Kane awoke to whispers. They were faint but insistent, like a chant carried on the wind. He sat up, drenched in cold sweat, and looked around the dimly lit room. His lantern flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows across the walls. He turned his gaze to the watch lying on the nightstand. It remained fixed on 3:13 a.m. He was beginning to suspect this was the moment when he first came to Blackthorn Manor. This realization caused his skin to chill over. Time, much like himself, was getting confined in that manner. The whispers grew louder, drawing his attention to the corner of the room. There, etched into the wall, was a new symbol that he was sure hadn't been there the night before. It looked like an eye, but its shape was jagged and uneven, as though it had been carved by an unsteady hand. Edward approached it slowly, fingers tracing the cold, damp surface. He felt a searing pain shot through his palm the instant he touched it, and he stumbled backward. The whispers grew louder, and for a moment he saw a vision, a pale woman, terrified, running through the manor halls, pursued by a dark figure. The vision ended as quickly as it had begun, leaving Edward gasping for breath. He gripped his palm, and there, etched onto it, was a faint mark now burning, a small version of the symbol on the wall. Edward went back to the library, determined to make sense of the events of the night. The morning light did little to dispel the oppressive gloom that clung to the manor. As he sifted through Victor Blackthorn's journal, a single passage caught his eye. The binding is not eternal. With each soul claimed, the watcher grows stronger, its chains weaken, and soon it shall walk free once more. Edward's hands shook as he read the next line. The marked ones are its prey. He stared at the mark on his palm, his heart racing. Was he now connected to the watcher? The thought was unbearable, but he pushed it aside. He couldn't afford to give in to fear, not yet. Edward spent hours scouring the manor for clues, retracing the steps of those who had lived and died within its walls. In the east wing, he discovered a nursery, its walls adorned with faded murals of smiling children and pastoral landscapes. The sight should have been comforting, but the air was thick with sorrow, and Edward felt a deep sense of loss. Inside an aged room where time peeled its paint along with faded, once brilliant colors from a wooden rock horse stood there, very slight, with rocking on when its side would slightly rise, causing his noise in creaking by. At that time, Edward froze, looking at it get wild and crazed to the final tip as its crash into the wood. And there was a torn piece of paper yellowed with age under it. Edward picked it up. His hands trembled. It was a letter written in a child's scrawl. Mama says the watcher will keep us safe, but I don't like it. I hear it in the walls at night and am scared. Please, Papa, come home soon. The letter was dated, Emily Blackthorn, 1682. Edward moved further into the manor by some strange compulsion. He soon found himself in a very long and narrow corridor. The sides of the corridors were bedecked in ornate mirrors, one after the other, with each a crack and some tarnished. As he walked, he caught glimpses of movement in the mirrors, shadows that darted out of sight the moment he turned his head. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the corridor with a cacophony of disembodied voices. He sees you. You cannot escape. The walls remember. Edward's reflection in the mirrors began to change. His face twisted and aged, his eyes hollow and sunken. He turned away, horrified, but the distorted images remained, following him like a cruel mockery. At the end of the corridor, Edward found a door unlike any other in the manor. It was iron, rusted and corroded, with thick chains draped across it. The chains were marked with symbols similar to the one on Edward's palm, glowing faintly in the dim light. The whispers were deafening now, urging him to enter. He pushed the door open against his better judgment. Beyond lay a chapel, the pews overthrown, the altar desecrated. The walls bore murals of scenes of torment, figures bound in chains, their faces twisted in agony. In the center of the room stood a statue of the Watcher, its form twisted and inhuman. Edward went forward, walking to the altar. Upon the book open upon it was written those arcane symbols, the same that had seemed to writhe in stone. And now he could read the words in its pages. The whispers, clearer and closer now, became words. Blood ties. Blood sets free. You have a choice. The ground began to shake beneath Edward's feet, and a low, guttural growl reverberated through the chapel. The chains on the statue started to rattle violently, and the murals on the walls seemed to come alive, their painted figures writhing in silent agony. Edward stepped back, but too late. The door slammed shut, trapping him. The chains around the statue began snapping, one by one, as a darkness started pouring out of it, its base. He formed from the mist. The figure shifting and unstable was a dark thing. Their eyes were hollow voids, and their voice was a blend of countless whispers. You cannot stop what has begun, it said. The walls will fall, and I will be free. Edward's mind was spinning. He had to move, but he didn't know how. The book on the altar might answer his question, but the way to it would place him perilously close to the Watcher. As the Watcher moved forward, he felt a strange warmth emanating from the mark on his palm. He began to glow, and the Watcher recoiled slightly, as if repelled by its light. Seizing the moment, Edward ran to the altar and snatched the book. He flipped through the pages of the book, searching for a way to tie up the creature. In his perusal, his eyes fell on a page that needed a sigil drawn in blood. The Watcher lunged for him, its shadowy form stretching across the room. Edward slashed his palm on a shard of glass from a broken window and started drawing the sigil on the altar. The instant he finished drawing it, the Watcher let out a deafening roar. The chains, which hung from the walls, sprang to life, wrapping around the creature and pulling it back toward the statue. The room fell silent, and the chains returned to their place, binding the Watcher once more. Edward collapsed to the floor, his energy spent. But as he looked around, he realized the victory was fleeting. The chains were weaker now, and the murals on the walls had changed. Where once they depicted bound figures, they now showed chains snapping and shadows spreading. Edward knew the Watcher's imprisonment was only temporary. He had bought himself time, but the true battle was far from over. The oppressive silence of Blackthorn Manor weighed heavier on Edward Kane as the days dragged on. Each step he took through the shadowed halls felt more deliberate, as though the house itself were guiding him towards something it desperately wanted to reveal. Or worse, towards something it wanted him to become. Edward stood in the great hall, looking at the old grandfather clock that dominated the room. Its carvings depicted scenes of triumph and tragedy, victories in battle, but also the twisted faces of the defeated. The clock's hands hadn't moved since Edward's arrival, perpetually frozen at 3:13 a.m. Yet now, as he watched, he could swear the second hand quivered. It ticked. The sound was deafening in the otherwise silent manor. Edward stepped closer, his heart pounding. With each tick, the air seemed to grow heavier, until the clock's face began to change. The once ornate numbers dissolved, replaced by jagged symbols, the same ones he had seen in the chapel and on his palm. The pendulum swung violently, its motion creating a low, rhythmic hum that resonated through Edward's chest. He felt the mark on his palm burn anew, and the world around him blurred. When he blinked, he was no longer in the great hall. Edward found himself in the manor's dining room, though it was almost unrecognizable from the state of decay he had grown accustomed to. The table was set for a grand feast, its surface littered with golden candelabras and gleaming silverware. A roaring fire filled the room with a warmth that was almost inviting. Men and women dressed in the finery of a bygone era sat around the table, powdered wigs, corseted gowns, and velvet coats. Their faces, cheerful at first, contorted into fearful expressions as they turned to look at Edward. One man, sitting at the far head of the table, stood up. Tall, dark-eyed, his presence was commanding. Edward knew him from the portrait in the library, Victor Blackthorn. "You shouldn't be here," Victor said, his voice like the growl of a distant storm. The walls groaned before Edward could answer. The ornate paneling warped and splintered. Shadows slid from the cracks, curling around the guests like living chains. Their screams filled the room as they were dragged into the darkness, one by one. Edward tried to run, but the floor beneath him gave way, and he fell into the abyss. Edward woke up in a place that was damp and dark, full of the smell of mold and decay, with droplets of water dripping feebly in the background, a sound he had almost forgotten existed. He was deep within the manor's cellar, a place he had previously not dared to venture out into. Shelves lined the walls, which were covered with dusty jars and leather-bound books. There were strange symbols etched into the stone. These pulsed softly in the dim light. As Edward searched through, he found a series of chained doors. Each door bore a different sigil, which was set on the wood of each one. As he approached, the chains would rattle, as though the prisoner knew that someone had finally arrived. One door was ajar, its chains broken. Edward hesitated, but the mark on his palm pulsed, pulling him forward. Inside, he found a small room dominated by a single object, a stone pedestal upon which rested an ancient key. Its surface was engraved with the same symbols that haunted the manor. The moment Edward touched the key, he was overcome by a vision. He felt himself standing in the very basement, but Victor Blackthorn now stands much younger, surrounded by a circle of robed individuals that could not be seen. Beside him rested a pedestal supporting the dagger, and its blackness seemed to speak of how it was made in fiery hell. Victor raised the dagger and, speaking in a language that neither Edward could understand, his voice boomed with unnatural force. The robed ones chanted in unison with him, their voices leading up to a crescendo. The ritual reached its climax just as a shadowy figure stepped out of the night, bound by chains made of light. It was the Watcher, its inhuman eyes burning with malice. Victor stabbed the dagger into his hand. His blood ran onto the pedestal. The chains on the Watcher pulled tighter, and it roared. The vision faded, and Edward was left gasping for air. He realized that the key in his hand was the same key Victor had, used to imprison the Watcher. The basement seemed to breathe when Edward walked back out on the main floor. Whispers in the walls became deafening, speaking words and phrases in disjointed sounds. He bound it. He paid the price. You will too. Edward's mark burned hot and sharp. He stumbled into the library and flipped through Victor's journal for any answers he could find. One passage leaped off the page. The key is both the lock and the freedom. To use it is to invite the Watcher into your soul. Edward let the journal fall from his hands. He now possessed the power to either strengthen the chains of the Watcher or break them entirely. But the cost of either choice remained unclear. Edward wanted to understand the truth. He went back to the corridor of mirrors. He did not avoid the distorted images this time. He studied them, noting how they shifted and changed with each step he took. There was one mirror larger than the rest. Its surface was smooth and unbroken, and in it he could see Edward's true face. As he drew closer, the reflection altered, showing a small, hidden door behind him. Edward turned, locating the door as being embedded in the wall. It was tiny and insignificant, but on his palm the mark throbbed as he drew closer. The door led to a spiral staircase, descending deep into the heart of the manor. Each step echoed like a drumbeat as Edward followed it. At the bottom of the staircase, Edward found a cavernous chamber. He was suffocating, but he could see the same glowing symbols on the walls as he had throughout the manor. In the center of the room stood a throne of black stone, its surface jagged and uneven. On it sat the Watcher, bound in chains that pulsed with an ethereal light. "You are brave, mortal," the Watcher said, its voice a mixture of whispers and growls. but bravery will not save you. Edward gripped the key tightly, his mind reeling. He couldn't approach the Watcher unprepared. However, visions and whispers had made one thing evident: he could not trust the manor. The Watcher leaned forward and rattled its chains, which clanked softly to the stone floor. "You desire freedom, but this comes with a price to it. If you let me free, I shall allow power you cannot even comprehend as the greatest thing at my will. If you won't let me go, you would simply remain here as they had before you." "You have a choice," the Watcher said, "but choose wisely, for the walls are watching." Edward realized that the manor itself was alive, its intentions as dark and twisted as the creature it held captive. The decision he made here would decide not only his fate, but also the fate of everyone who had ever fallen under Blackthorn Manor's shadow. The air of the chamber was crushing, oppressive. Each breath taken by Edward Kane was a struggle against some unseen force. The Watcher sat enthroned, shackled, and yet unbroken. In the faint light, its chains glimmered, a reminder that still lived, pulsated, in the creature. Edward clutched the ancient key, his cold skin biting into the metal in his palm. He could sense its otherworldly power pulsing through him, reaching out to him, and the decision he wasn't prepared for. "Do you see now?" the Watcher asked of him, its voice a mad jumble of whispers and growls. "The truth about this place. You are not first, nor will you last." The Watcher waved toward the walls, and the glowing symbols burst into light. Shadows leapt across the stone, creating images that played out like a dark theater. Edward saw glimpses of the Blackthorn family: Victor, his wife Lillian, and their young daughter Eleanor, standing in the manor's great hall. Victor held the same key Edward now carried, his expression grim. Lillian wept silently, clutching Eleanor to her chest. Surrounded by robed figures, their faces obscured, the symbols on the walls seemed to shimmer with malevolent glee as the figures chanted in unison. The scene shifted, and Edward saw Victor thrust the key into a hidden lock, sealing the Watcher within its throne. The creature's roar echoed through the chamber, shaking the very foundation of the manor. "Victor thought he could control me," the Watcher said, its chains rattling. "But his sacrifice was in vain. The manor chose me, just as it has now chosen you." Edward stepped back, his mind racing. The Watcher's words confirmed what he had always feared. Blackthorn Manor was alive, its will somehow tied to the creature it contained. He thought of the whispers in the walls, the distorted reflections in the mirrors, and the mark on his palm. The manor had been guiding him since the moment he stepped into it, manipulating him toward this moment. "What does it want from me?" he whispered, his voice weak, a little trembly. He looked away, the laughter mocking as it made Edward feel something claw inside of him. A vessel, that's all. An excuse to live in, fuel to feed its power and energy. "You are well marked, Edward Kane. You are the key." As the Watcher spoke, Edward's eyes were drawn to a corner of the room where a small, shadowy figure stood. It was Eleanor Blackthorn, her ghostly form flickering like a dying flame. "You have to stop it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My father tried, but he was too late. The manor took him, just as it took me." Edward's heart went sore as he looked at the child. She could not have been more than 10 years old when she died, yet her eyes held a sadness far beyond her years. "How?" Edward asked, his voice cracking. "How can I stop it?" Eleanor pointed to the key in his hand. "Break it. It is the only way to break the cycle. But be warned, if you fail, the manor will consume you." The Watcher's laughter filled the chamber. "Do not listen to her lies. The key is power, Edward. With it you can shape your destiny. Break my chains, and I will give you everything you desire: wealth, power, immortality." Edward hesitated between the seductive promise of the Watcher and the desperation of Eleanor. The weight of the key seemed to grow heavier in his hand, as if urging him to choose. He thought of his life before Blackthorn Manor, the failed relationships, the crushing loneliness, the unrelenting search for purpose. Here, in this cursed place, he had found something greater than himself, a mystery that demanded to be solved. But at what cost? The room was in motion while Edward remained fixed in thought. Walls creaked and twisted with the glowing symbols pulsing like a heartbeat. Whispers of the walls began to grow loud until the cacophony was almost unbearable. Edward felt himself going mad. The mark on his palm flared with the fire. The key felt full of life in his hand, and he knew that he did not have much time left. The Watcher leaned forward, its eyes glowing with anticipation. "Choose, Edward. Embrace your destiny or face the abyss." Edward gripped the key tightly and stepped forward toward the Watcher. The creature's chains clanged in response, and its grin grew wider. Instead of unlocking the chains, however, Edward turned and threw the key at the throne with all his might. The key shattered on impact, its pieces scattering across the chamber. A blinding light erupted from the throne, and the Watcher let out a deafening roar. The light consumed everything, and Edward felt himself being pulled into its embrace. When Edward awoke, he was lying on the front lawn of Blackthorn Manor. The once imposing structure was now a crumbling ruin, its walls reduced to rubble. The mark on his palm was gone, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt clean and untainted. He looked around, half expecting the Watcher to appear, but the creature was nowhere to be seen. As he stood, Edward noticed a small, ghostly figure standing at the edge of the lawn. It was Eleanor, her form now solid and peaceful. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. "You've set us free." Before Edward could respond, she vanished, leaving him alone with the ruins of the manor. Edward returned to his life, forever changed by his time at Blackthorn Manor. The memories of the Watcher and the horrors he had faced lingered, but they no longer consumed him. He dedicated himself to uncovering the truth about other mysterious places, determined to ensure that no one else would suffer the same fate. But every so often, in the dead of night, he could swear he heard whispers in the walls,